Thank you so much, Phil. Hi, everybody. I'm Laila, and I'm really thrilled to talk with you today and to share with you my thoughts around digital accessibility and learning when to flex. I often feel like I'm a bit of a politician when I'm working in the accessibility space, and I was trying to think about what it is that I do, and that's how this talk came to be, to share my tips and tricks for accessibility in a corporate context. Next slide, please. So my role is I'm the head of design, research, and accessibility operations at Xero. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Xero, Xero is a cloud-based accounting and small business software. And we have products in Australia, New Zealand, the States, Canada, Singapore, the UK, and South Africa. There's a picture of myself on this slide. And so it's a good opportunity for me to describe myself. So I'm a white female. I've got dark brown hair just past my shoulders, and I wear glasses. And a fun fact about me is I have astigmatism in my left eye. My older sister accidentally poked me in the eye with a stick when we were young and playing. And that means that now as an adult, I really don't like dark mode. So I know lots of people really enjoy dark mode, but for me, it makes it really difficult for me to read text displayed in that way. So I'm a bit of an original person. I prefer a white background with dark text. So in my role as head of design, research, and accessibility operations at Xero, I pretty much think about how to optimize processes, how to scale our systems, how to embed change within our design organization, our design research organization, and within the entire organization when it comes to digital accessibility. And so that also means I'm responsible for improving the accessibility of our product. Okay, next slide, please. So today I wanted to share first my journey when it comes to digital accessibility. And like most people, it's a personal one. So the first time I started to think about accessibility in a digital context was when I became a carer for my younger brother who has schizophrenia. And I was helping him to find accommodation and find jobs and to work with the social systems in Australia. And what I really noticed or observed was that it was very difficult for him to interact with online forms. His disability meant that he struggled to read complex words and understand complex contexts, and therefore filling in a form was really difficult. I've included an image of my brother and I. He looks a little bit more South American than I do. I have South American heritage, so he's a little bit darker than me. He's got very short dark hair. He also wears glasses and he likes to have facial hair. At the moment, he has a plaited beard, which isn't in that picture, but he thinks it's quite cool. I am still unsure, but hey, his body, his life. So as well as looking after my brother for a number of years, my next foray into the digital accessibility space was with Coles Group. So Coles is a large supermarket chain in Australia, and they were actually sued in relation to the accessibility of their online website. And they've got over 200 digital assets. And it was my job to establish the digital accessibility capability at Coles and to ensure that we were delivering accessible experiences for our customers. And then following that experience at Coles, I took on the role of head of digital accessibility with Xero when I relocated to New Zealand with my family during COVID. And it's a similar role at Xero in that I'm establishing the digital accessibility capability and embedding accessibility across the org. And then more recently, my eldest son has been diagnosed with ADHD. And so as a parent, I'm really starting to see how that impacts his life. And I'm quite keen to observe him and understand how his neurodivergence impacts the way that he interacts with technology. Okay, next slide. So today I wanted to talk you through some of the challenges that my teams face and also how we're operating to overcome these challenges. And the reason that I wanted to share this information was twofold. So first of all, if none of it's new, I just hope that you feel reassured that you're not alone. But if there are some new things that you learn in my talk, I hope that you'll feel better equipped to land digital accessibility in your workplace. All right, next slide. So I wanted to kick off with some of the challenges that I've come across in my time working in digital accessibility. And these are just the common things that I come across as a digital accessibility professional. So the first one is tight timelines. And this is really, I've lost count of the number of times that I've been told that a team doesn't have the time to make their product accessible. There's simply just not enough time and therefore they can't do it. Another common challenge is getting engaged too late. So I've observed many teams who want to make a product accessible, deciding to start with an accessibility audit, which is really well intentioned, but they tend to be doing this right before their planned go live. And working with these teams is heartbreaking as they're really, they've got their heart in the right place, but they're going about accessibility in the least efficient and the least productive way that they could. Another common challenge is around skills gaps. So I get asked a lot about what a good accessible experience looks like, and we get many requests for training materials, and we hear from full stack engineers that they don't have the front end development skills that they need in order to learn about accessibility. So skills are a real challenge. This next challenge won't surprise many of you at all, and that's the small budget or reduced budget. And I really feel like this relates to the skills challenge. So where teams feel they have those skills gap, they feel like the way to approach that is to build in extra time so that they can create a product as they learn about accessibility, or bring in consultants to fill that skills gap. And obviously that costs money. So lots of people will push back and say, hey, I'd love to, but there's no budget. Deprioritization is another significant challenge. And it's usually an accessibility advocate who will come to me trying to get help to prioritize an accessibility bug that they really want to fix. And they'll share their struggles with getting the bug prioritized amongst the security patches, the new features that their customers want, or other compliance priorities. So getting accessibility issues to be fixed in the context of everything else that people are trying to achieve in a product org is significantly challenging for our teams. And then last but not least is a challenge around siloed teams. So at times we can do so much work on accessibility internally, but when we look at the experience from a customer lens, we actually realize that the experience hasn't improved much at all. And this can be due to siloed teams. So this is when you have many teams working on the same customer journey. And so in order for that journey to become accessible, we actually need to teach many more people about accessibility for there to be a truly positive impact for our customers. So the structure of your organization can also greatly impact their ability to make the product more accessible. Next slide. Thank you. So when reflecting on those challenges that I just shared, I really felt like there were 3 root causes. One of them being skills, the next being incentives, and the third being systems. So I'll talk to those a little bit. So when I talk about skills as a root cause, this really comes from the feeling that when designers, engineers, and our QA practitioners start their careers, they typically haven't learned about accessibility, and accessibility isn't part of their definition of done. And this puts organizations on the back foot as they have to teach accessibility to all of their design, product, and engineering capabilities before they can actually start to build accessible products. So it'll be really great to see accessibility being taught within educational institutions as an integrated part of definition of done, so that when our designers and our product owners, content writers, and engineers come into the workforce, they actually don't feel like they've done their job unless they've delivered something that is accessible. So the next root cause I wanted to talk about was incentives. So creating products is a busy business with many competing priorities. Balancing customer security and compliance needs is no easy feat. So therefore, if leaders are not incentivized positively or negatively to make products accessible, accessibility frequently falls to the bottom of the pile. Organizations that are progressing well with accessibility are incentivizing their leadership to deliver accessible products. So a really good example of this was one of the orgs I worked with. We were struggling with engagement from leadership in relation to accessibility. So we used the Australian Network on Disabilities Access and Inclusion Index score to assess the organisation and its accessibility progress. And what that score has is a public leaderboard of who is doing best in Australia in their access and inclusion scores. And this was an amazing motivator internally within that organisation, because they wanted to be on the top of that list, so visibly and publicly achieving in the accessibility space. And that's a great example of a positive incentive to drive accessibility within an organisation. So the last root cause I wanted to unpack was systems. So organizational systems are key when embedding accessibility, and I've observed a number of key systems which will be crucial to the success of your accessibility programs. So the first one is design and customer-led thinking. So accessibility requires organizations to value talking about customer needs upfront and to prioritize spending time upfront testing with customers, including customers with disabilities, and iterating until all customer needs are met. So your org needs to value and know how to be customer-led. So if they're currently solution-led and spending very little time upfront engaging with customers, asking them to make the product accessible and asking them to spend that time upfront requires a mind shift that they haven't done yet. So that takes time. Another system that's really important is your procurement systems. They need to enable you to control the accessibility of your procured products. So if you're working on your accessibility internally, but you're purchasing external products to complement your product range or to use internally with your team members, and they're not accessible, you're actually taking yourself and your organization backwards, and you're having to spend additional time to bring yourself to where you need to be. And then the other system that's really key is your risk and issue management system. You need governance structures to ensure that accessibility policies and processes and standards are met and maintained. When those structures don't exist, it's very difficult to hold people accountable to the accessibility of the product that they're building. And so I found that in organizations where that doesn't exist, it takes much longer to embed accessibility, accountability in. And actually, I don't want to have to create a process for an organization to manage risks and issues. That's quite a big job. So, you know, it's a real challenge. If those systems aren't there, you really have to establish things on your own or drive parts of the organization to move forward so that you can then go along with them. All right, next one. So how do we work in this context? So with all of these challenges and with these significant root causes that will take considerable time to overcome, what do we do? And so today I really love to share some of my strategies. And these are things that I've learned with my teams. This is obviously not something I do on my own. And I'm really grateful to my teams for helping me to learn more in this space each and every day. So my key learnings about knowing when to flex. So number one is that flexibility is key. You can be a sleuth. It's not a top up or a bottom up strategy. It's a delicate balance of both. And it's not using the carrot or using the stick. It's mostly carrot with a touch of stick. And I will unpack all of that now. Next slide, please. So flexibility. Flexibility is key. And when I think about flexibility, what I'm actually talking about is learning. And to learn, you need to be flexible and you need to be ready to fail. So I've created I guess it's a diagram. So I have a text box which says test and learn, and then an arrow coming out of that text box which says get ready to fail. And then I have a second text box which says retro often, and an arrow coming out of that which says listen, listen, and listen again. So it's really important to be ready to learn and to take action based from your learnings. But why do you need to get ready to fail? So the reason I feel like you need to get ready to fail is because organizations, like humans, are unique. And what worked in one organization won't necessarily work in another. So I reflected about how I combat this challenge, and I've used a number of different frameworks to help with my accessibility strategy. So some of those frameworks include human-centered design, or the double diamond, lean methodologies, and specifically the lean canvas within lean methodologies, and issue-based problem solving. I recommend that you have a look at the frameworks that your organization uses and apply these to your accessibility program. So for example, we use the human-centered design double diamond to design our accessibility training program. We started with discovery to understand with how our teams like to train rather than leading with a training solution. And once we knew how the teams liked to train, we then understood their ability levels and designed a training pilot, getting their feedback on our proposed solution as we built it. After the pilot, we completed a retro, and we then updated the program, and we continue to refine and pilot until we get it right. Our program today is dramatically different to what it was when we started. And if you'd asked me at the beginning what I thought the training program would look like, I would not have described where we are today and where we're heading. We're actually about to kick off a whole new discovery piece to refine it even further. So I guess the key outcome is get ready to be flexible and get ready to learn. Next slide. So my next strategy was one that I found hard to learn because I'm a little bit of a rule follower. So it took me a while to get this one. But essentially, you don't always have to follow the rules. Sometimes you can be a sleuth. And so I've created a diagram here which has the product development life cycle. So it's got a series of boxes with the labels understand, define, develop, test, and deliver. And then there's a red dotted line around develop, test, and deliver, and an arrow pointing to that red dotted line saying the pushback zone. And what I've observed is when you start getting pushback, it can be really easy to feel overwhelmed and to feel like you need everybody on board with digital accessibility before you can start. And then you can start creating these really big change management strategies, and you feel like accessibility is a long way away. But that's not the case. You can actually start really, really small. You can start with just a single designer or a single content writer or a single engineer or a single tester that is also passionate about accessibility, and then work with them on improving their knowledge in the accessibility space. Once they start making their designs and their builds accessible, the product will start to be more accessible. And all of this can happen whilst your product owner or your tester or the ones that are pushing back are absolutely none the wiser. Hence, you can be a sleuth. So you can do small things whilst you set up your stakeholder buy-in and accountability. So whilst you work on the skills gap, whilst you work on the internal systems that stand in your way, you can actually improve the accessibility of your product with the people that are already advocates and want to do more in this space. The greatest thing about doing small things is that you actually build that group of advocates who don't feel like accessibility is hard. So accessibility then has a positive connotation. So people are talking about the enjoyment of making a product accessible or how easy it was to make a product accessible, rather than the often negative feedback that comes for accessibility when you're at the reactive stage. So when you're doing auditing and you're remediating bugs. So this is very much a proactive approach to accessibility for building accessible products. So next I'm going to talk about balance. Next slide, please. So balance is about thinking about your strategies and making sure that you're not doing too much of one thing over the other. So I've had a go at another diagram here. So this one has a smaller triangle, which is pointing down, and that's labeled policies, risks, and OKRs. And these are top-down strategies. And then there's a larger triangle, which is pointing up, which says support, train, and reward, and they're examples of bottom-up strategies. And then between the two, you have the teams doing the work. So the teams doing the work are impacted by the top-down strategies that you use and the bottom-up strategies that you're using. So I know I just told you that you can be a sleuth, but there's actually an expiry date for this bottom-up technique. Because if you focus on only bottom-up techniques, your teams will eventually get blocked by leadership. And I had a business analyst come to me once quite upset because I was questioning them about how they were going with digital accessibility. And she said, you don't understand the pushback that I'm getting. I am trying. I've taken your materials. I've upskilled myself. I'm getting everything ready, but the leadership in the team do not understand and they won't prioritize it. And that's an example of too much bottom up and not enough top down. So if you focus on only bottom up techniques, your teams will get blocked by leadership. And if you focus on only top down, your teams won't have the skills required to deliver the ask. So you need to use both techniques. Just back to the slide, please. So when you're using both techniques, your team will hold the clues to give you an idea of when you're out of balance. So if engagement is low, you've got lots of accessibility bugs that are not getting fixed, and you're finding that your advocates are demotivated, then you need more top-down strategies. So think about raising some accessibility risks or linking accessibility to your company objectives and key results. If you're getting lots of requests for accessibility support, lots of people saying accessibility is very difficult and hard, or even eye-rolling, and I'm sure you've all had it from your stakeholders, you typically need to do more bottom-up work. So this is typically a sign that your teams don't feel like they have the skills to do the work, so they're not enabled. So you need to think about how you support them, how you train them, and how you reward those teams that are delivering accessible products. Don't underestimate the importance of balancing the top-down and bottom-up strategies. If you get stuck, you're out of balance, essentially. All right, now we can go to carrot and stick. So as you do balance your top-down and your bottom-up strategies, you also need to think about how you speak about accessibility. You need to balance the carrot and the stick. So the carrot is the human-first approach. This is sharing user stories, sharing customer feedback, and celebrating teams that are doing accessibility well. Essentially, it's humanizing accessibility. The stick is all about threatening legal action, raising risks, and punishing teams that are not doing accessibility. I actually learned the hard way about the perils of using the stick too much. When I first started working in accessibility, because the organization I was working with had been sued, I very much led with that narrative, and I spoke about the legal implications of not making the product accessible. And what happened is actually people just assumed that I didn't understand the business. They thought I was stupid. They felt like I had a complete disconnect between their world and my world. So that's an example of why leading with the stick doesn't always work, and it's much better to lead with the carrot. And also I'll talk a little bit later to organizational context, which is key. So the stick can be used, but use it sparingly. So when you raise risks, only raise the most critical risks and make sure that the team can realistically mitigate the risks. Raising risks is okay. It's a tool you will need to use. Just use it sparingly and be very considered. As a rule, default to the carrot. If you're doing enough top-down strategic work, then the carrot should be really effective. I will note that some leadership teams respond better to stick, and this is simply because they're used to managing risks and weighing up priorities. They might need the stick to make the best decision about which risk to manage first. So for example, they might have an accessibility risk and a security risk. And so they actually need to understand the legal implications of both in order to make the right call. Okay, next slide. So I've run you through my strategies. So some of the things that I use, so being flexible and using proven frameworks, being a sleuth sometimes, balancing top down and bottom up, and lastly, the carrot and the stick. But how do you know when to flex or how far to flex? What guides you, I guess, in knowing which strategies to use when? So that's the next thing that I'm going to talk to. So understanding how to flex. I was reflecting on how I decided when to push and when to step back a bit or pivot with my strategies. And this is the bit where I feel like I'm a bit of a politician. And I've boiled it down to three things. So I created a diagram. It's a Venn diagram. So we've got a circle which says understand your customers, a circle which says understand your advocates, and a circle which says understand your business model. And those circles overlap to indicate that the sweet spot is the strategy that helps to address all of these three areas. So first of all, understanding our customers. It's really important to understand what your customers need the most. And you might think that it's a fully accessible product. And yes, it is that in the long term. But in the short term, it could actually be something totally different, like an email address for them to send their questions to. Understand what delivers the most value to your customers at this point of time for them and relevant to them. At the same time, you also need to understand the business model that you're operating within. So what drives action within your organization? You need to listen. Is it objectives and key results? Is it key performance indicators? Is it the current business strategy? Which tools and systems are actually used and followed? How do you get accessibility into those? You want to pair accessibility into the processes and the frameworks that are successful within your organization. And you must remember that timing is key in a corporate context. If your house isn't on fire and others are, you need to step back for a little bit. Leadership and teams will not be able to listen when they're attending to another really big issue. So it's about finding the right time to insert in the accessibility work and coupling it in with processes and programs that work within the culture of your organization. And then lastly, you need to think about the needs of your advocates. After all, it's the purpose of most accessibility teams to make themselves redundant. So the needs of our advocates are extremely important because they're the people that are going to continue accessibility forward. So you must think about, how do they like to learn? How do they like to be supported? What type of materials work the best for them? Accessibility is strategic. You must be pragmatic, and empathy is key. And lastly, learn how to work this system. Thank you.
Thank you, Laila. Outstanding. Outstanding. What time do we have? 1:30 almost. So lots of opportunity for more discussion, which is really, I think, what makes this XCon really special. So appreciate that. So what I'll do is go through, I'll just give you a few comments and read a few comments, get us started, and then move into some questions, okay? And just from my personal point of view, I just wanted to say how much I appreciated, it took a lot of notes. So maybe I'll save that for the end. So Laila, Nikki said, I'd love to see accessibility taught in schools from the very beginning. We already teach children to read books and digital content. Why not teach them about screen readers so they understand things like the need for alt text really young?
I couldn't agree more. And like, I'm observing in my son's school, my son's in primary school, he's 10, and they're talking so transparently about neurodivergence. And they're really creating a great environment for schools to start educating about assistive technology and how different brains work and how different bodies work and how people interact with the things around them differently. So I feel like in my context in New Zealand, it's a really good time to be starting to do these things. It feels like a good time. Yeah.
Thank you. Another comment from later in the talk, you'll recognize when. Yikes, I hear both sets of complaints So I guess we need more both top down and bottom up.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I work with my team. You know how I said it's all about my team. This accessibility is a team sport. And so I'll often go to the team and say, hey, I think I need to do a little bit of this. And then they'll come in with another perspective and be like, oh, actually, I've been talking to the engineers and I think it's a little bit more of this. And then we'll come to a decision together on the best way to move forward. But you're right, it is often a little bit of both. So with some stakeholders, you might be doing top down and others you might still be doing bottom up. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. This one appears to have the most upvotes on the Q&A side, and that's from Sarah. How do you respond to the argument there's not enough profit in accessibility and requests for proof of users that need it?
Yeah, look, the request for proof that users that need it, it's hard not to get offended when you've been in the accessibility space. But I think with the users that need it, we tend to refer back to the Microsoft inclusive persona. And yeah, inclusive personas. I feel like I've had a brain fail. It's not called that. Are they called the
kits? Yeah,
inclusive design personas? I think it's called, where you talk about when you solve for accessibility, you actually solve for many more people than those that identify as having a disability. And actually, I did create a slide once for leadership, which showed the link between, it was the fact that the same users that love keyboard accessibility are people with disabilities, but also our power users within our product. So I really just brought it back into a group of users that was really important in the organization, and we were getting a lot of traction in the organization when we were talking about power users and that they were a valuable customer for us. And so I was linking accessibility in with something that worked. So that worked quite well. And then sometimes I just, on the tracking, I go back to the ethical side of it. So exactly what are you planning to use that information for? Why is that important? So that's more of a stick again. So starting to balance the carrot and the stick, so the human side, and then also if I need to, having to come in and say, actually, ethically, I think you need to think about why this information matters to you. One other thing we did is when we did our user research, we collected information about access needs. So not disabilities, access needs. So do you find it difficult to read text? Do you need to resize? And actually we found we got a high number of participants self-identifying as having access needs. We found that more useful than actually identifying disabilities, because I don't identify as having a disability, but I absolutely have an access needs that my glasses cover because of the stigmatism in my left eye. And so I find if you can start to shift the conversation into a more productive area, then you can kind of avoid that tracking piece.
Thanks, Laila. And I'm going to mark this one from Tanis closed because you answered it. And that was, I'll just reiterate so everyone's clear. How do you get around the fact that self-identifying as a person with disabilities is maybe inappropriate? And you said access over
disability. Yeah. And look, we are still trying to figure out as an organization whether we only want to ask about access or whether we also want to ask about disability. And we've not landed on a spot yet for that. What we're going to do is test both for a little bit and then see what feels right, see where we get good engagement from our customers. So we will learn. And then as soon as I know more, I will happily share back. But yeah, we're still experimenting with that, if I'm really honest. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that honesty. Yeah. It's always moving target, perhaps. And the feedback will be essential. So.
Yeah.
No assumptions. Okay. Sarah asks, how do you toe the line between advocacy and ensuring your passion doesn't translate to guilt tripping, particularly for people that have never thought of ableism and in general might feel defensive?
This is where the empathy comes in terms of putting myself in their shoes. And this took time. Like I said in the beginning, I was much more aggressive when I pushed accessibility. And it was really when people started eye rolling me and telling me that I was silly and I just didn't understand, that I realized I needed to get into their shoes to understand. And so it's about getting really close to what their needs are and what their context is, and then being creative with the way that you approach accessibility with them. So saying, okay, I understand at the moment there's a lot of compliance pressure for you, and the number one objective set by your leadership is to address the compliance issue. That sounds like a lot going on for you right now. Let's talk about accessibility and the benefits of doing accessibility proactively versus leaving it to the end. So if you do it proactively, then you create an accessible product, and it might take you a little bit longer initially. But the cost and the amount of time you're going to need if you leave it at the end and you have to rebuild the entire UI is, that's significantly more effort. But let's look at it in the context of this compliance piece. Maybe that is the way it has to be this time, because you truly have to put everything in compliance. So what are the quick wins from an accessibility perspective? What are the things that are low complexity that the team could address in their downtime when they've maybe got a jog day? For those that don't work in tech, a jog day is a day where teams get to work on whatever they like, and it's quite common. And so maybe accessibility could be used on a jog day. Maybe it could be used for a theme for a hackathon. So trying those techniques, or thinking about, does your product have a mobile version as well as a web version? Could we prioritize one of those first? Could we first address the mobile experience? Because in web right now, you really need to do this compliance bit. So it's about being empathetic to where they're coming from and being willing to be creative with them. And then I find they're like, oh, okay, no, they're trying to help. Like, this is not just another person banging their fists on the table. This is actually someone that wants to listen to me, understand where I'm coming from, and to try to help me.
Awesome. Thanks, Laila. I'm going to keep going because we still have several on the board here. Diane asked, not a question, just friendly advice for the group. You can comment. When including accessibility in your procurement, make sure your contract includes that. If there's an issue found, the fix should be done by the vendor at their cost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well to that.
Yeah, and I think timeframes are really key, and like that's something that I used to support procurement and sit with their meetings with vendors to talk about accessibility, because a lot of vendors didn't know what WCAG was or why it was important, so we had to educate them. And one of the things I like to do is understand, well, how frequently do they release? Because some organizations are not releasing every fortnight, they're actually releasing twice a year. So therefore, we needed to understand it as an organization that if we found accessibility issues, it would take 6 months before the fix could be implemented. And so, yeah, I agree. I think definitely write it in the contract, but also understand the timeframes for remediation as well, just so that you don't get a nasty surprise when you get into that situation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also a life cycle, right? And
yeah,
pre-contract, contract, post monitoring of the contract.
Yeah, and I mean, it's such a shame, and it's not uncommon to like work in an org and then everyone's really excited about the brand new acquisition or the brand new product, and you're like, I did not know about that. I wonder if accessibility is in there or if they even knew. And then you look at the contract and you're like, oh, it's 3 years away before we can fix this if it was missed, I tend to start with procurement when I go into an org. It's one of the first groups on my list is having a chat with procurement, because procurement love processes in my experience. So if you can just add it into their templates and their processes, it starts to run on its own. And look, ideally you're there to support procurement, to help with questions, but a starting point is just having it in there as criteria as well. Yeah.
Like maybe some gated questions that.
Yeah, it typically comes across as gated questions. And with that, I try and keep it to like 2 questions, because What we don't want is vendors having to answer 158 questions in order to work with your organization. That's not fair, especially if you're working with small companies. We want small companies to succeed, especially with Xero as an organization that supports small business. So it's very important for us to keep that number of questions down short. Yeah.
Great point. Thank you. Ready for another one?
Yes.
Okay. Diane asked, in your experience, which company OKRs were the most effective to get exec buy-in? Were they SEO metrics, UX metrics, or others?
Yeah, great question. It was the efficiency metrics. They would seem to be the easiest ones to attach ourselves to. So, yeah, about building in efficiency in the organization. So this was talking about the rework cost for accessibility. So if we make it accessible from the outset, then we save a whole lot of rework costs. And we are currently working on embedding accessibility into our usability measures. That's a really fun piece of work. And I look forward to being able to more purposefully link accessibility to usability. But I hadn't been able to do that in the past without what we have now, which is a way to measure accessibility, usability along with our usability framework. So that took time to get there. Yeah, so we've been focusing a lot on efficiency, and I really want to go into usability as we move forward. Xero is a global organization, so another helpful thing I had was if we have objectives to do well in particular markets, then I can attach into that market. So say, if you want to be successful in this market, this is their accessibility landscape. This is the legal landscape for them. So therefore, we need to look at the accessibility of our product. If you want to be successful in that market, you also need to be accessible. So that was a very Xero specific thing that worked quite well for me.
Terrific. Thank you. Let me mark that one closed. And our next highest is from Allison. Is there a US equivalent of the public leaderboard you mentioned as an incentive?
I'm not familiar with the public leaderboard. Is this a leaderboard with companies that are doing accessibility really well?
Well, the one you mentioned, she's referring to the one you talked about.
Yeah. Is there a US equivalent? Or I don't know because I don't live in the US. I'm sorry. I'm trying to learn more about the US. Do you know, Phil?
I don't, but I think our maybe our crowdsourcing will
Yeah.
find the answer. Yeah.
I mean, I did work with an organization who did a global access and inclusion index for me, but they didn't have a leaderboard. So they were able to service me as a global organization rather than just that other one, which was Australia only. But yeah, no leaderboard. Oh, no, isn't there the top? I don't know. I'm going to stop talking. Let's see what someone else comes
I have something in mind that I'm not going to, it's not 100% clear, so I'm not going to start talking about that. But I have some sense of a site I've seen. Yeah. Mel followed up with, he would be curious if there's an international version of the leaderboard. Working at a multinational company, it would be to know a scale. So scoring in general, something to look into is what I think the big takeaway.
Yeah.
You called it an incentive for the leadership.
Yes. And I'm not going to get the name right, but there is like there's something 500, and it's companies that commit to accessibility and working together on accessibility. Yeah, I'll have to come back. We'll have to find that and I'll come back to you. I know who will know, so I just need to ask her when she wakes up. She's in Australia, so she won't be awake yet. Yeah.
And Deanna commented, thank you, Deanna. I was referring to disability in.
Okay.
One thing to look into. Great.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Me too. Ready? Okay. What actions do you find most effective for shifting corporate culture towards accessibility and inclusion?
I feel like it's kind of the whole talk, but what action most effective? It's going with the systems that are already there. It's just it's putting it into something that's already working. Like, we tried so hard to embed accessibility into ways of working, but actually it wasn't until a new product requirements template was created that we actually started to get more traction. And so this is where I was talking about the maturity of the organization is really key. And so like once we were able to hook into something new that had traction and buy-in and everyone in the business was doing it, and then we just add accessibility in, that kind of work that felt the easiest, I guess, because we weren't having to do as much advocating. And now we just monitor how the engagement's going in that area. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember you saying, like with some of the frameworks you mentioned, Lean Canvas or HCD Double Diamond, things like that. You said those were, what really stuck out was you said use what's already being used.
Yeah.
Is that something where you have a story where you tried to introduce something and it maybe didn't get traction?
Actually, that one came from Maria and my team, and we were talking about it, and I was like, if I run through all of these 3 frameworks, it's too confusing. And she said, no, Laila, you use the one that's already there. That's what we're doing. And I was like, oh, you're totally right. We've been mainly using human-centered design where I am now, but previously I was able to use Lean Canvas really well because that was what we were using in that organization. So yeah, it's I've got to give credit to Maria for that one. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. A couple more, we just have some comments I'm going to read in the last, we have 3 minutes, so 2 to 3 minutes. Okay. Let's see. I love to also bring up the fact that the need for accessibility is going to look so different in 10 or 20 years time. Population will by default have increasing mobility, visual, or cognitive issues due to aging will be used to the technology, or to needing tech, she says.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I had a really difficult stakeholder years ago. And I did talk about that. I'm like, well, you might not feel like this is important to you now, but when you're older and as your eyesight declines, this will become more important to you. And it was a real click moment for them. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, anyone who, I remember using that line in some trainings. Well, I had it ready. It's not something I really want to use, but like if someone's really resistant, just ask them if they think they'll be using a tablet when they're 60 or, or whatever is current.
Yeah, exactly. And
of course.
I think a lot of people that work in accessibility have had an experience where, or they know somebody that has been in an accident or something's changed for them and they now live with a disability. And it's often that when they go from being able to access everything to then suddenly having to learn how to do it all with assistive tech, that you go, oh my goodness, I didn't know. I had no idea. And so that tends to help people get in. Yeah.
And that might explain, yeah, a lot of people working in the field now.
Yeah, yeah.
Well.
Yeah, it's common when I interview people, they'll say, oh, my cousin was in an accident and he's now quadriplegic. And as I observed that, and it's much like my own story, my brother's schizophrenic and I observed him trying to work with technology and I understood, oh, there's a problem here, right? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to just see if I can get one more in. Or let me do this. I want to thank everyone for all the great. We did have. I want to apologize for some slide quality concerns at the beginning that dominated the discussion, but just for a few minutes, and we got to focus on your talk. So that will be cleared up with in the on-demand version. No worries there. And the slide deck is available for download. Do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with that you may not have gotten to say?
I think I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to talk at AxCon and to have this discussion. I love that it is a discussion. There's so much for all of us to learn and for me to continue learning. When I first created this presentation, it was totally different stories. So we all evolve and we all learn more each and every day. So thank you. And I look forward to reading all the comments and getting your feedback. Thank you.
Great. Well, we appreciate you and everyone, and hope you've enjoyed AxCon. We'll see you next year and keep the conversation going. Thanks.